Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our new study in The Problem of God by Edgar Sheffield Brightman, published in 1930. This is Brightman's first manuscript, and it's kind of his first look at the doctrine of God. We're going to take a look at the first 60 pages. We're going to look at page 13 to 73 and get a good look at the introduction to this project by Brightman. Let's begin by looking at block 1 and the idea of God. Brightman says that the idea of God is the highest concept of which the human mind is capable. Our God idea measures our valuation of life. We presume that the idea of God is capable of change. God as concept abbreviates real being, creator, and supreme being. Next, he wants to discuss the idea of God and consciousness. God is a personal consciousness for Brightman. He is a source of goodness, beauty, and truth. And out of tradition, we know that practical doubt arose out of tradition, and the question of ethical behavior arose out of tradition, and the question of practical sovereignty also arose out of tradition. It did heighten the questions concerning the idea of God. Then he gives a little bit of information about the idea of God and epistemology, and he mentions Hegel, who he really does admire. And he says that Hegel's phenomenology of spirit stated that every human mind must pass through the death of God and God's overcoming of death. Religious experience does not provide us with conceptual certainty, says Brightman. It does provide consolation in despair, and it's founded upon the abandonment of Christ on the cross, which is exactly where Hegel led us, and Brightman wants to pick that up. So he says we focus on the abandonment of Christ on the cross when we begin talking about the notion of the idea of God. But it is going to be personalism, so it is going to be God as personal consciousness for Brightman. He links that with the idea of values. We want to take a look at block 2. We know from our previous lessons that moral values play a significant part in Brightman's overall system. Moral law plays a significant role in the idea of God. So in block 2, God idea as hypothesis, the idea of God is a rational working hypothesis for Brightman. In all knowledge, there's an element of faith, and there is logical incompleteness. Values are real and imperative. Therefore, Brightman says materialism must be negated. We negate mechanistic materialism. We negate science claiming to be the finality of truth. We affirm emergent novelty within evolution. The idea of God is a dynamic movement. The view of matter is now currently considered an activity rather than a substance. The concept of mind must be posited when considering empirical experience and empirical knowledge. We never acquire any concept that is beyond the need for modification or revision. Science on its own cannot account for value, and he defines this emergent evolution as at certain stages of evolution there arise new forms of life that exceed prior conditions. Therefore, we posit the notion of emergent novelty or emergent evolution. So if you look at note 3, block 2, note 3, the idea of God and emergent novelty is better explained by idealism rather than materialism. If we deny God, then we must bear this burden. Brightman says to exist is to value existence. Truth-loving requires revision of values and the realm of values. An organization of values must always take place for the individual personality. So we can see that Brightman is linking the idea of God with the idea of moral law. We know that from previous lessons, but now we're looking back at his very first project in 1930, And he's already talking about this link between the idea of God and the idea of value, or the organization of value into a holistic system of ideal values. He's already at that point, at this very early stage in 1930, 12 years before the maturity of his system ever developed. But it's interesting to look back this way, I think. We already looked at the later work. Now we're going back to his very first work. I think it's an enlightening path to take to see how these ideas did take birth for Brightman. But even in 1930, he was talking about the link between the idea of God and the holistic idea of organization of ideal values. He's already talking about a holistic system of value and how that it is essential to an idea of God. So if you move on to block 3, we'll take a look at how he moves on to the concept of God as working hypothesis, which is going to fit in with the notion of dialectic. So under block 3, he begins with humanism that must be negated. It's trying to substitute itself for God. Humanism says that religion equals a devotion to betterment of human life. Devotion to society is substituted for devotion to God. Society becomes supreme being. And there's an antipathy toward theism. But Brightman says that still leaves humanity with a longing for spiritual focus, for the cosmos. And so he wants to look at the notion of spiritual focus in that which is the empowerment to negate humanism. He says humanity still seeks out the author and the sustainer of value, but we do question a God idea which is overly eternal and overly static and unchangeable. Theism traditionally posits that human values stand in relation to a cause of value that is beyond man. Personalism posits a God as working hypothesis. That's Brightman's position. Empirically, we seek to define the idea of God through the concepts of the infinite whole, there's that holistic system again, and by the rational evaluation of the possibilities of experience. So for Brightman, the idea of God is a working hypothesis of personality. A working hypothesis of God as personality. Religion is personalistic monotheism. God is a universal being as source and purpose of existence. We begin by the process of rational interpretation of experience. Our task is to form a holistic account of experience, the holistic account of value experience. The history of religion reflects an expanding and ongoing and developing dynamic idea of God as working hypothesis. So Brightman is giving us his introductory lesson here in this volume, but we can see already in 1930, very early in his career, he is already linking the idea of God with the notion of moral law. A system of moral values is already that which must be necessarily linked with the idea of God for Brightman at the level of phenomenology, because he begins with the empirical. We know he begins with the empirical. He tells us that. He begins with experience, with the possibilities of experience, and the holistic account of experience. That is phenomenology. He begins there. So it's just an introductory lesson this time, but it's an introductory lesson that teaches us that Brightman, very early on, wants to look at the idea of God as an idea that must take up consciousness and value and a personalistic view concerning epistemology. And definitely it will be rooted in Hegel for Brightman, and it will begin with that abandonment of Christ on the cross. And Brightman's system wants to answer that abandonment and interpret that abandonment, just as Hegel did. And it must be taken up in a personalistic way a personalistic consciousness must be taken up for the concept of God, for the idea of God, and it must be linked to value. Even in 1930, Brightman was already emphasizing the notion of ideal values as that which speaks to the concept of God, because there is the evidence in objective reality of emergent novelty. Emergent novelty exists in objective existence. That points to an idea of God for Brightman. There is this notion of that which is beyond the given, that which is transcendent, truly emergent novelty. But it is going to be a dynamic doctrine of God. It's going to be a dynamic personalism, not static in any way whatsoever. It's going to be an ongoing dialectical position. So we get an introduction here that really gives us the groundwork for what Brightman wants to do way back in 1930 with his book on the problem of God. Very early in his career, but he's already linking together in these first 60 pages what it means to speak of the idea of God. It must be dynamic, it must be value-centered, it must be hypothetical and ongoing dialectic. So he's already bringing these ideas together that we've already examined by first going through his later work and now looking back. I just think it's a great way to get some great illumination at this point of early work to really see how these ideas are being brought to birth. So it's great to see how these concepts emerge with Brightman very early on. But for this first lesson, we simply need to remember that the idea of God, you notice in block 1, immediately leads to value, and it leads to consciousness, and it leads to an epistemology that is one that must deal with the abandonment of Christ. It's an epistemology that must deal with the abandonment of Christ. So block 1 immediately tells us value, consciousness, and abandonment need to be taken up in this idea of God. And then block 2 tells us very early on that this working hypothesis for the idea of God is going to be one that deals with the emergent novelty of a comprehensive, coherent system of value. And it's going to be an organization of value that the individual and the corporate body will take up. And there'll be an ongoing work of organizing this holistic system of values. That also is very evident early on. And that leads to his conclusion that his idea of God will be a working, moving hypothesis, which he doesn't use the word dialectic, but by mentioning Hegel, we know that he means dialectic, and he mentions Hegel first thing. So here's our very first lesson. It's an introduction, and pages 13 to 73. We'll pick up next time on page 74.